Humans are assumed to be survival-oriented organisms. In a Darwinian sense, natural selection should favor behaviors that enhance our survival and reproductive success. How, then, do we explain self-destructive behaviors, addictions that ruin health, gambling that squanders resources, or compulsive patterns of sabotage? Such behaviors seemingly undermine an individual's fitness and well-being. If the human organism seeks to further its existence, self-destructive behaviors present a paradox. On the surface, at least, these actions appear to contradict the basic evolutionary drive for self-preservation. Some evolutionary thinkers have attempted explanations. For example, theories of inclusive fitness suggest that in extreme cases, an individual who perceives themselves as a burden with no reproductive prospects might unconsciously calculate that their demise spares their kin a drain on resources. Other evolutionary models invoke mismatch theory, the idea that modern temptations, like refined drugs or casino gambling, hijack ancient neural reward circuits, leading to maladaptive overindulgence that our Stone Age brains didn't evolve to handle. These perspectives, however, only partly address the issue. The broader question remains: why would our unconscious mind drive us toward actions so detrimental to our survival? If such self-defeating impulses arise from layers of mind beneath awareness, do they signal a breakdown in evolutionary logic, or simply a deeper logic of the psyche operating on its own terms? Sigmund Freud confronted the puzzle of self-destructive behavior early in the 20th century, especially after witnessing the horrors of World War I and treating patients with traumatic neuroses. Freud observed that people often repeat painful or self-defeating patterns without obvious benefit. For instance, trauma survivors reliving their nightmares, or individuals sabotaging successive relationships in similar ways. He coined the term repetition compulsion to describe the mind's uncanny drive to replay distressing events or behaviors as if stuck on a loop beyond the pleasure principle. Such repetition seemed irrational. Why would someone's psyche compel them to suffer again rather than seek pleasure or avoid pain? Freud concluded that a powerful force beyond conscious pleasure-seeking must be at work. In his book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he introduced the controversial idea of a death drive to account for these phenomena, just as he had posited a life instinct that drives humans toward love, sex, and self-preservation. Freud now theorized an opposing instinct oriented toward aggression, destruction, and death. This death drive, in Freud's view, was an unconscious urge, ultimately seeking a return to a lifeless state, a radical addition to the human motivational repertoire. He saw evidence for this drive in the very patterns of self-harm and cyclical misery that prompted his theory. War veterans' compulsive flashbacks, addicts' self-poisoning, and even suicidal thoughts seemingly pointed to an innate urge to undo life. If the pleasure principle couldn't explain such behavior, perhaps an unconscious death instinct could. Freud wrote starkly that the aim of all life is death, suggesting that life harbors a self-defeating principle at its core. The key implication of Freud's theory proposes that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious drives that do not necessarily align with our conscious self-interest or survival. In Freud's model, the rational ego is capable of steering at times, but is frequently overpowered by deeper instincts. Addictive or self-sabotaging behaviors, then, are not simply moral failings or conscious choices. They are expressions of unresolved unconscious conflicts. From Freud's perspective, free will is sharply limited by these hidden forces. Unless a person brings these drives to light, they are likely to remain under the sway of unseen impulses. A compulsive gambler, for example, might be unconsciously punishing themselves due to guilt, or repeatedly staging situations of loss to master a childhood trauma, all without understanding why they feel driven to ruin. Freud's theory thus challenges the notion that we are fully in control of our actions. If a destructive compulsion originates in the unconscious, the conscious mind's role in initiating the act is arguably an afterthought. To Freud, the destructive act may appear voluntary, but its motivational engine lies buried in the unconscious. The theory of unconscious drives becomes even more unsettling when we consider how people who perceive themselves as fundamentally good can still carry out acts of devastating self-harm. They would never hurt another person, but slowly, quietly, they destroy themselves. The alcoholic parent who would never wish addiction on their child still drinks alone in the dark. The compulsive gambler who prays for their family's well-being still empties the account at midnight. They would never consciously inflict such suffering on others, and so the only morally acceptable target becomes themselves. This is not hypocrisy. It is the tragic result of a psyche in conflict with itself. What they cannot direct outward, aggression, shame, despair, turns inward. They are both the victim and the perpetrator, and yet neither fully. This, Freud might say, is the unconscious at work. The death drive disguised as virtue, guilt masked as self-control, destruction performed under the illusion of restraint. But doesn't this contradiction, the good person harming themselves, seem even more illogical than the self-destructive act itself? It becomes more intelligible when we stop thinking of the psyche as a unified whole. Consciousness is not a single spotlight. It's a layered, fragmented system. Freud's structural model was one of the first to suggest this, but modern psychology agrees. The human mind operates across multiple strata of awareness. Executive consciousness, the voice that knows, plans, and judges. Habitual or procedural consciousness, the part that acts automatically. Emotional memory, where early trauma and pre-verbal learning live. Dissociative fragments, the parts that split off to survive pain. The shadow self, the part we deny, but which still acts. This explains the bizarre duality so common in addiction and compulsion. I know this will hurt me. I can't stop. I am the one doing it. It doesn't feel like me doing it. In this split, the tragedy deepens. The conscious mind may condemn the act while the unconscious drives it. The person feels both present and absent, guilty and helpless, agent and prisoner. And this, perhaps, is Freud's most haunting legacy, the idea that we are not whole, not by default. The self is a battleground of conflicting motives, many of which operate outside our awareness. Real change, then, requires more than willpower or discipline. It begins when these internal layers are brought into dialogue, when the ego stops demonizing the shadow, when the rational mind begins listening to the wounded, fearful, or angry parts that act in the dark. This isn't about erasing the darkness. It's about integrating it so the person who acts is the same one who knows why, so that we no longer say, it doesn't feel like me, but instead, it is me, and I understand why. Only then does agency return. Only then can the I begin to act in wholeness.